This video will walk you through the process of entering independent expenditures into a report when the independent expenditure is paid for in an earlier reporting period than it is disseminated or otherwise publicly distributed. There are two ways to report this type of activity in FEC-File. The first option is to report the independent expenditure on line 24 of Schedule E in the period when it is paid. The other option is to report it on line 21B as an operating expenditure in the period when it is paid, then report it on line 24 of Schedule E when it is disseminated. Let's start with the first reporting option. In this video, we'll be disclosing an independent expenditure for a $10,000 media buy that was paid for on March 1, 2016, during the April quarterly reporting period. However, it will not be disseminated until the next reporting period. Beginning at the Summary Page tab of your committee's report, highlight line 24, then right-click and choose New. Start by entering the necessary information for the vendor. Since you have already entered a transaction using this vendor, click on their name in the box below so it populates in the name field. Next, since the independent expenditure has been paid for but not disseminated, fill in the disbursement date field and only provide a dissemination date if it is known. If it is unknown at this time, leave the dissemination date field blank. In the description field, indicate that the payment is for future dissemination so it is clear why there is no 24 or 48-hour report for this expenditure. Now, continue entering all of the other required information for line 24. Once you have entered all the required information, click OK to return to the summary page. Since this report contains a Schedule E, ensure the report has the additional required signature. At this time, the software will prompt you to modify the selected report. Click Yes. For this example, there will be no further reporting requirements for this independent expenditure at this point. Keep in mind that a 24 or 48-hour report may be required at the time of dissemination. Now, let's move on to the second reporting option for this scenario. In the reporting period when you pay the vendor, enter the payment on Schedule B, line 21B, as an operating expenditure. This is because the activity doesn't meet the definition of an independent expenditure until it is publicly disseminated, which in this case will be in a later reporting period. To enter the vendor payment, right-click on line 21B and choose New. Then enter all the necessary information for disbursement on line 21B. Be sure to include a purpose that makes it clear that the payment is for a future independent expenditure. When you are finished, click OK to return to the summary page screen. When you finally disseminate or publicly distribute the independent expenditure in a later reporting period, you will need to disclose the activity is now an independent expenditure on line 24 and no longer an operating expenditure on line 21B. To do this, we will first itemize the independent expenditure and its date of dissemination on Schedule E and the reporting period in which it occurs. Then we will itemize the previous expenditure on Schedule B as a negative entry. This will prevent inflating the total disbursements. For this example, the independent expenditure will be disseminated during the July quarterly reporting period. To enter the transaction on Schedule E, right-click on line 24 and choose New. Here, you will enter all the required information for an independent expenditure on line 24. Please note that you should only fill in a date in the dissemination date field as the date of payment took place in a different reporting period. Therefore, you should leave the disbursement date field blank. Once you have entered all the required information on line 24, click OK to return to the summary page. Next, you will need to create a negative entry on line 21B to offset the expenditure that you have entered on the previous report. To do this, right-click on line 21B and choose New. You will now need to enter all the required information for line 21B. Be sure to make the amount field a negative entry for the same amount of the original expenditure on line 21B. In this case, our original disbursement was $10,000, so we should report a negative $10,000 here. This will ensure the cash on hand balance is correct. You should also reference this entry with the original entry on line 21B so it is clear why you are reporting it as a negative amount. You can do this by making note in the description field. Now that you have entered all of the required information for the transaction on line 21B, click OK to return to the summary page screen. You will see the independent expenditure populate on line 24 with the negative entry on line 21B. Since this report has a transaction on Schedule E, go to the Report screen and add the additional required signature to the report. At this time, there are no additional reporting requirements for this independent expenditure on the Form 3X. However, any required 24 or 48-hour reports will need to be filed. For additional reporting requirements and scenarios of independent expenditures, or to close and upload reports, please continue watching the other videos in this series.